Now, I may not be no David Dimbleby, but we are going to have a go at our very own Tackling Poverty question time. And unlike the real thing on BBC, this is live, so who knows what will come up in our responses. It's a very great pleasure to welcome our panellists, who are starting further on the left. Owen Jones, author of Chavs, and a regular broadcaster and commentator, who you may have seen in Question Time very recently, in fact. And next to Owen is Judith Robertson, who is head of Oxfam Scotland. Moving along, Phillip Blond, director of Respublica, the think tank, and author of Red Tories. I'd like to also make a special warm welcome to Ghazala Hakeem, who's next. I just want to say a word about Ghazala. She's kindly given us a note to describe her interest and her expertise. Just let me read this out, because it's important that if you're not familiar with Ghazala and her work, that we get better acquainted. So Ghazala is a single mom from Govan Hill, south side of Glasgow, who's involved in all different kinds of voluntary and community activity. She was one of the original testifiers at the Poverty Truth Commission. I'm sure many of you will be well acquainted with that process, in which she testified how poverty affects her and her daughter. She's still with the Commission and trying to tackle the effects of poverty in this city, and is part of the Poverty Alliance campaign called Stick Your Labels, which the social media folks tell me is on Facebook, so do follow it if you can. She's also part of the Tackling Poverty Working Group, which has been set up by the Community Planning Partnership in Glasgow, and most important of all, is passionate about making a change for the better for the marginalised. And last but not least, on the right is Anna Coote, who is Head of Social Policy at the New Economics Foundation. I'm sure Anna will remember that it wasn't yesterday, but a few years ago, we were both at IPPR. Anna was my boss. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what Anna and our panellists have got to say. Please welcome our panel. So, Poverty Alliance put out a call for some initial questions, and we have a few of those. I'm going to come to people who've posed those questions to share them with the panel. First of all, though, we wanted to start off with a very broad chance for our panellists to describe their view of where we ought to be going on this agenda. So our opening question to you is, taking a minute or two, could you describe your vision of a more equal society marked by less poverty over the next 10 years? And maybe just a word about what we should be doing to achieve it. Let me start with Owen.
It's quite a broad question, isn't it? Well, firstly, my starting point is work isn't an automatic route out of poverty as the way it's presented by politicians. Most households, as everyone in the room will know, the majority of households in poverty have at least someone in work. So unless we tackle the issue of working poverty by having a living wage in this country, then we won't be able to solve that poverty crisis. More broadly, the unemployment crisis, officially it's at 2.7 million, but we can forget that figure. If we include people who are economically inactive and people stuck in part-time work because they can't get a full-time job, it's over 6 million people at the moment in this crisis. We have to tackle that. And in terms of welfare reform, now, as the government would have it and as the media would have it, the reason we have such a large welfare bill is because of scroungers sitting on the sofa all day watching Jeremy Kyle. But the real reason is a triple crisis. It's a jobs crisis, it's a housing crisis, and it's a low wages crisis. Those are the issues we have to tackle if we're going to bring down the welfare bill without actually kicking people at the bottom. But finally, it's about voice. the real issue, and we won't be able to address any of these issues unless people living in poverty have a voice in this country. They're organised and they're heard, because they've been almost completely airbrushed out of existence by the media and political establishment.
Thank you. Judith.
My vision really is a very different, it's a reversal of where we're at the moment. It's thriving communities, local communities, who can tap into the resources that they have in those communities easily, respectfully, and with the engagement of a public sector which is prepared to support them. What I see happening in communities at the moment is we're at war with those who are supposed to be representing us, and that needs to be turned around. We need to have a public sector that is supporting local organisations to achieve the ends they want. Now that includes the private sector in that discussion and dialogue. They have a huge amount to contribute to local communities, but they have to be empowered to do that and held to account to do that. I agree that in order for that to happen, people need to be organised, mobilised and have a voice. It will never happen unless we turn that around. But there's another end of the spectrum, because it's not just going to happen at a local level. It has to happen structurally, it has to happen economically, and we have to change the purpose of our economy. And you'll hear echoes of this probably over the next few days, but change the purpose of our economy to something which serves us. That we are not the servant of, and the structures, the inequalities as they're currently sitting at the moment, need to be reversed, and the money that is pouring out needs to be poured back in, and that has, I think, the potential to be transformatory. But in order for that to happen, we need to see a different kind of politics. We need to see a politics which is prepared to take big and bold decision. And in order for that to happen, we need to see a mobilised population who's prepared to support that. So there's quite a lot to do.
Thank you. Can I come to Phillip on what would be your pathway to change, Phillip?
Well, I mean, I think, let's be clear, almost all of the debate and the ideas that I've heard so far, I heard 30 years ago. And the terrible and disturbing truth is that all of the attempts, the conventional attempts to address poverty don't work and aren't working. And the reason they don't work and they aren't working is they're still trapped within something that actually structurally increases poverty. If we really want to tackle poverty, and I really do, we need to be far more fundamental in our analysis of its causes. And I want to suggest to you the way we use welfare and the way we think of welfare is intrinsically related to why people are poor. Because the fundamental assumption we made in the 20th century was that the poor couldn't own and the poor couldn't trade. And we said, let capital stay with the rich. We won't challenge monopoly ownership of capital or assets. We will just redistribute the products of their transactions for everybody else. Well, the basic fact is redistribution can never, ever, ever catch up with wealth production, and it never will. And if we remain trapped in this hopeless logic of arguing for a little bit more from the state, then I'm afraid people get poorer and poorer, because the structure of world capitalism has profoundly changed. And what we see is the massive capture of assets and the ability to trade by those at the top. Let me give you one statistic. In the 1970s, the top 1% of US families owned 9% of US GDP. 2 years ago, the top 1% of US families owned 23.5% of US GDP. Income is important. We need it to stabilise people, but it will never, ever, ever stop the poor from being poor. You have a very good report that I was just flicking through on assets, Scottish Anti-Poverty Review. Very nice transformative article in there. Until we can concentrate on assets and access to markets, nothing we say will have any traction. I'll end on one factor. The Labour government, just before it left office, commissioned an inequality survey. It was really good. And what they found was that in income, between the top 10% and the bottom 10%, it varied, depending how you define the household, between 4 and 8 times. So those at the top earn between 4 and 8 times the income of those at the bottom. But when it looked at assets, what it found is those at the top had 100 times more assets than those at the bottom. So what I want to suggest to you is forget this welfarist approach. It's well-meaning, well-intentioned, but it's the road to disaster. Be more radical. Talk about mass ownership. Talk about a new ownership and asset agenda. And then talk about business, because the true origin of wealth is business, ownership and trade. And talk about how our economy has been captured by oligopolies, monopolies that don't pay tax, that trade offshore, squeeze out small and medium-sized enterprises and stop people getting ahead. If you do that, in 20 years, we might actually begin to create a mass wealth-owning, trading, engaging population. That's the route. All this stuff about welfare, though I agree with many of the problems, particularly for the disabled, and that's not the route to change. The route to change is profoundly different. So to conclude, if you really want to shift things, if you don't want to be here in 50 years saying the same thing, because we're saying the same thing as we said 30 years ago, time to follow a different approach.
And just to probe a little on that, Philip, I mean, is the fact that we see in many ways quite different outcomes in terms of inequality in Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark and so on, is there something uniquely different about the British and American approaches to this? I mean, can we imagine within welfare capitalism a better route by looking at some of our neighbours? I
think that's a very good point. What the Europeans have done is they've managed to maintain some notion of shared value, some notion of common collectivity, where the state and the private sector both function to create infrastructure. What we've done in this country, both through the left and through the right, is we've destroyed notions of shared value. I know on the left you think, God, no, we haven't. We always talk about collectivity. But the abstract collectives. Nobody loves the state. And because you don't love the state is not a site for people to come together. It can work in small countries where the state can have much more immediate impact. But in larger countries, it's very difficult. The state can't be the centre where we come together. So I agree with Judith's point that actually what we need to do is start again at our localities and our communities, build common values from there. Because unless we do that, what we're going to have is a world that just believes in individualism. The trouble is, if you believe in individualism, all the gains will go to powerful individuals. Everybody else will lose, and then we'll have a state that comes up and picks up the pieces. And actually what we've got is a very corrupt system. We've got a corrupt system that only works for the already wealthy and the already well-positioned. And then we've got a welfarist, statist that just binds up the wounds and sends people out to the same battle, which they're destined to lose. So again, we've got to really remake the settlement. And you're crucial to that. You're absolutely crucial because you're in the majority in Scotland. And your views, if they remain conventional, will keep you trapped in a conventional approach that will fail. But if you change, if you shift to a more radical, transformative approach, one that actually delivers wealth and ownership, then you can change not just this country, but the rest of the United Kingdom. And that's what we need from you.
Thank you. So maybe not reform, but transformation is a message there. And I just saw a tweet going down which says, Phillip Blond is already more interesting than I thought he would be.
It's one of the nicer things.
So Ghazala, could you give us, coming back home, a local perspective on the question about tackling poverty and inequality?
Well, I think it would be wonderful to have a more equal society in terms of finance. Well, we should have a more equal society in terms of all the inequalities, but poverty is the theme here. And there's varying levels of poverty all over Britain and in Scotland. The need for poverty to be eradicated is, I think, wishful just now, as we, the people, are concerned about the cuts and the austerity measures. There's uncertainty and there's worry. Ideally, the eradication of poverty, not just Scotland-wide, but worldwide, would be the desire. But being the pragmatic person I am, I know it's going to take far more than 10 years to eradicate that. But what we can do within the next 10 years is collectively come together as a nation, irrespective of politics or class, etc., and honestly start making decisions and, more importantly, actions on how to reduce poverty to get nearer to that vision of a more equal society, which will be marked by less poverty.
And Anna, how does this debate sound? Is there a different way?
Thank you. Very nice to be here. I can't tell you, and I really wish I had a Scottish accent. I'm very sorry that I don't. And I'm sorry there's only one of us on the platform here with...
I used to live in Falkirk.
Anyway...
in which case you're used to even smaller crowds than Kilmarnock.
You asked for the vision of a more equal society. Well, the first thing is we've got to have a different government. We have to have a different government here in Scotland, and we have to have a different government in England. We will never get anywhere near a more equal society with the government that we've got now and with the arrangements that we have now. So that's the first thing. And I think there's no vision unless you've got a pretty well-developed idea of how you're going to go about it. And one of the most important things I want to say is what we mustn't do. And what we mustn't do is think that we can tackle poverty by identifying communities that are poor, vulnerable, or at risk, disadvantaged, you know, all those words that are used, or individuals who are poor, vulnerable, at risk, or families, problem families, and regard them as the object of policies that are there to help them. So subject them to barrages of parenting classes and advice on nutrition and exercise and remedial education, because what that does is it situates those communities, those people, as the problem. And they are not the problem. And don't believe for a minute that if you think that just by telling communities that they can rise up and free themselves from poverty and disadvantage, that will happen. Because in this day and age, or probably in any day and age, that will never happen unless we do things collectively. And that means doing them at a national and at a subnational level through the state, which after all we vote for, we own, and we, at least in theory, control. So don't let's throw out the baby of the state with the bathwater of the system that we disapprove of now. We need the state to protect the rights of individuals, to protect the most vulnerable, to make sure that essential services are there where we need them, and to enable us, in fact, to have voices when we don't, to have, be able to take action locally. So let's reinvent our relationship with the state. I think we need to do that. So let's blame the poor and assume that we can solve their problems by getting them to be more resilient and able to cope with the disadvantages that they have. But to look at the underlying causes for those disadvantages and tackling them. And that's about tackling the way that the economy is run, it's about tackling the structures of power in our society, and it's by looking for some much more radical solutions. And if I can just end by making one other related but perhaps less controversial, but still quite, I think, a radical suggestion, because if we're going to move towards a more equal society, I think we need to think about time. Now, Owen mentioned the problem that we have, that people who are trapped in part-time jobs when they really want full-time jobs, but there are lots of people out there who have work and lots of people who don't. And lots of people who don't have enough time to do all the other things we need to do, to be parents and carers and neighbours and friends, and to use our own time for ourselves or whatever it is. And I think we need to think radically about a redistribution of paid and unpaid time, because it will help to get jobs to people who haven't got them. It will help to make jobs that people have more manageable and cut down stress and anxiety at work. It will help to get some of us off a consumer treadmill where we work to earn and we earn to consume, and we consume at the great danger to the natural environment on which all our lives depend. So lots of reasons for thinking about a redistribution of time as part of this package of finding new ways, new and positive ways of moving out of poverty into a different kind of society and economy.
So a politics of time, assets, work sharing, looking at ownership, all these going much further than kind of reform agendas we may be used to from our governments. Who wants to pick up any of those points or make a different point before we take our next question, maybe 2 or 3? So there should be a roving mic or 2 from our Poverty Alliance colleagues. There's just this table here. Gentleman with his, yep. Thank you. And then we'll come to here. Thank you.
Andy Mile. Andy Mile, Scottish Environment Link.
Shout it out, Andy. Oh, here we are.
Andy Mile, Scottish Environment Link. Great transformational ideas from all five members of the panel. But would they agree with me that one of the things that we have heard about over and over again for the past 40, 50 years is the widening gap between the richest and the poorest? And yet we never have an annual measurement in this country, Scotland or the UK, to say that the gap has been widening according to government policy or closing. Would it be a good idea to actually have such a framework so that we had one target? Because if there is one target which we need to achieve if we're going to tackle poverty, it is that that gap, both in income and in assets, is actually going in the other direction rather than the direction it has been going in. And to get there, would the panel agree that actually we need to get away from the corporatist nonsense that puts us on the course of forever chasing infinite economic growth, and that we need to reassess completely the concept of growth and the way that we measure a society's success only in terms of gross domestic product rather than social well-being and environmental sustainability?
Thank you. And Judith at the front, thank you.
Hi, my name is Ed Archer and I'm from the Friends of Volunteering in Clydesdale. One of the things I don't think has really been touched on is the need for a new economic strategy where actually everybody benefits. And this strategy should be based on the precepts of Keynes. Maynard Keynes was a great economist, and he realized the need for jobs for people, and jobs for people are crucial. It's crucial for the wealth of everybody in getting people back into work. Every day we see masses of cuts in people's jobs, cuts in support for the voluntary sector, which is crucial to our society. Now, these cuts are actually detrimental. They are not solving anything. We are slaves to the so-called free market economy, which enslaves us. We need to break away from the free market economy, and we need to have jobs for people and stop exporting our jobs to other countries to create work here, which people want. People don't want to be on welfare. They want the opportunity to work.
Thank you. And Sarah, also down here at this table. Briefly, if you will, please. Thank you.
People always say that just when I'm just about to speak. Willie Black, North Edinburgh Fights Back. We brought 15 people from our community through here to link up with as many people here that want to fight back. And I think that we've got an opportunity in the next couple of years that we've never had before, because everybody's going to be asked the question, do you want an independent Scotland? And the second question should be, what kind of Scotland do we want? So we've got a chance for that big political questions to be put into the agenda. We who want to tackle poverty, we want an end to poverty, have got a chance to put everybody on the back foot of what they've done or what they've failed to do. And we want communities to rise up now. We don't want what Anna Coote says, that communities that are fighting back, that's not the answer. That is the bloody answer. Because I can go back 30, 40 years when we had a different agenda, when we had a grasp on some kind of redistribution. We lost that because we got cuffed. We got beaten in the miners, we got beaten. And that's what happened, it was class. We need to rise up like a class again and grab back the wealth that was stolen over the last 30, 40 years for us. We need to defend everything and fight back and demand more.
So you don't need me to say that there's a lot of passion and not a little anger in the room, I suspect. I'm going to ask Owen to respond to that final point, because you've written about the demonisation of the working class, and language matters as well as actions. What do you make of...
Well, firstly, you're right to be angry. There's a lot to be angry about. And when we talked before about inequality in our society, in 1979, Britain was one of the most equal societies in the Western world. It's now one of the least equal. And in fact, only Portugal is the least equal in Western Europe than Britain. And as you say, it was a wealth and power grab which took place in the 80s and 90s. But when we talk about demonisation, this is what Thatcherism did. In 1979, she said, there is no such thing as primary poverty in this country. OK, there are people who don't know how to budget, don't know how to spend their earnings, but she said you are left with a behavioural personality defect. That was at the heart of Thatcherism, that we don't have social problems in this country. We've got individual failings. It was the same mentality when the whole get on your bike, which became a national cliche under Thatcherism at the peak of mass unemployment. But what I'd say, just to bring back actually some of the other points about sustainability and growth, which Andy raised, one of the things you can put those together, the environment and growth. If we look at what Germany have done with the Green New Deal, they have an active industrial policy, so they've caught the renewable energy boom. They've invested in so-called green-collar jobs, good skilled jobs which are secure, and that's why they've got a youth unemployment rate of 9% and ours is hurtling towards 25%. That's what we should be talking about. But as well as that, just to come back, that last point about people don't want to be on welfare, there's an alternative we should be saying to welfare reform, and this is what I'd say, because often we're defensive. The reason the benefits bill, as I briefly alluded at the beginning, is so high is firstly a housing crisis. Billions of pounds are being wasted on housing benefits, which is lining the pockets of private landlords in this country, not going into the pockets of tenants. We should use those billions and actually build social housing, which will create jobs and stimulate the economy. And when I asked Hazel Blaze before the last election, why didn't you Labour do anything about housing in its 13 years in power? She said there was just no one in government interested in housing. That is why it comes down to representation and voice. Because if you have people who've been stuck on a social housing waiting list in Parliament, they force it to the top of the agenda. And the other issues are low wages. Tax credits are a lifeline for millions in this country. But let's not be under any illusion what they are. They are topping up the low wages of people because employers are not paying their staff properly. We should fight for a living wage so taxpayers don't have to subsidise the big bosses in this country. And also it comes down to jobs, of course. As I said, 6 million people who can't get a secure job in this country. And as that notorious voice of left-wing propaganda, The Telegraph, pointed out last month, there are 22 unemployed people chasing every vacancy in this country. Unless we address the threefold crisis, jobs, low wages and housing, we will not bring down the welfare bill without, as this government is doing, kicking the poorest people in society.
There's time if one of you wants to pick up on either of the other points.
I think I want to pick up on the point about sustainability and GDP. Because we don't really want this to be all about problems, but we have another problem, which is even in Scotland, which compared to what else is happening in some of the rest of the UK is a beacon of social justice kind of development and sustainability. We have a completely united approach to our economy. There is no, at the moment, I hesitate to use this phrase, but there is at the moment in our political establishment no alternative to that of growth, GDP and the development of the economy the way it has traditionally been developed. The slogan Smart, Successful Scotland is about continuing to put money into wealthy elites. And that, from my perspective as Oxfam, we need to understand how our public sector budget is allocated and look and say, where's that money going? Who's winning? Who's losing? We actually know the answers. There's plenty of evidence as to what's happening to that money. And it isn't going in to creating the jobs in communities. It isn't going in to, it's going in to sustain the inequality rather than to challenge it. And it's going in to sustain unsustainability rather than transform it. So I don't know how we're going to get this message across. Because it seems to me that in a vacuum of political leadership, I don't mean around the constitutional debate, but around the transformation of our economy to serve ourselves, it seems to me these ideas are not in short supply, but our political class is not listening to this set of ideas, because they're there for the easy picking. And I welcome ideas from the floor as to how we can make that happen. It may be revolution. It may take that in communities. It may mean 10 years of what's going to happen as a result of the changes in welfare reform before people really are so angry that we cannot fail to listen any longer. But from my perspective, that's what's going to happen. It can happen in Scotland. I actually believe it can happen in Scotland. Living here, experiencing that relationship with the Scottish Government and seeing that capacity, but we have to have a better way of encouraging our politicians to listen.
And Phillip, briefly if you would, because our next question anticipates this and goes further on it. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, to the last question, what would it be to fight back? Right? We followed kind of the old Marxist, unionised approach, and it failed, and it's failing across the world. Now, I want workers to win. Workers who do not own will always, always be defeated. But workers who own, and I'm being more radical than any Marxist analysis here, workers who own cannot be defeated. So the real strategy is, how do we convert a model that is clearly exploitative? We have low-wage work that doesn't deliver. The state subsidises it through tax credits. The profits are offshored for a tiny minority. That's completely corrupt. And in that sense, a Marxist analysis has some traction to it. But the path isn't to argue for a little bit more, because that's not nearly enough. The path is, let's mutualise. Let's try to find a way we can create radical new forms of ownership structure. So we move from a supermarket model, where people are essentially, where average wages are at 16 grand, whereas the wages of chief executives are at God knows what, to a John Lewis type model, where everybody has some form of stake. Now this takes us to the real 21st century future. Most of our economy is vertical. Most of it is we buy off people who are above us and the money goes to them and to outside the country. What we have to do, and this is an element of Judith's point, is we have to create horizontal economies. We have to start trading with each other. Because if we start trading with each other, we can break monopoly and oligopoly, which is one of the greatest enemies of the poor, and we can start to create ownership and trade at the bottom. And that's where I think a radical localised agenda where we start to create assets and ownership at the bottom can really, really change anything. And actually is far more radical than Marxism.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to move on.
Sorry, that was a bit radical.
To our second question. The question comes from Andy Milne of Surf. Could you put your hand up, Andy? And, thank you. Microphone's coming your way. Thank you.
I hesitate to take the role of the chair here, but are no women going to ask any questions in this room? Come on, get your hands up, the women. Sorry, Andy.
That's all right, Judith. Apologies for not being a woman, but I'll do my best. I do feel to some extent, Jim, that this question has already been raised by Andy behind me, but nonetheless, since it's a Blue Peter exercise of here's one I prepared earlier, here goes. If all of us really nice, positive people in this room are concerned with addressing inequality by levelling upwards in the interest of fairness, what are the implications for consumption and sustainability both here in Scotland and globally?
Thank you. And let me just take the woman at the back who very patiently had her hand up. Apologies, I couldn't see with the lights. Could we send a microphone just to the back? I think it may be related to this. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Tamara Muhura. I'm from the North Edinburgh Women's Group. One of the person, has already touched on it, but seeing that the long-term unemployed people, are, the chances of them going back into employment, is really getting slim, especially, when they are kind of like depressed and demotivated, etc. And seeing that, microfinance, has actually worked, elsewhere, in the developing and also the developed world, in America. Does the panel think that, maybe cooperatives, and microfinance and social businesses, would also help out, with the unemployment?
Thank you. I think those 2 points go together really well. Let me come to Anna first. I mean, we've been debating the alternative economy, a different pathway to sustainability for quite some time now. How are we doing? And what tools do we need to put in place, and who needs to own them to make this stack up?
Well, that's a big question, isn't it? I want to agree with the point that we can't rely on growth, both because growth is unreliable because of the state of the national and global economy, and also because I'm convinced by the evidence that continuing growth in the developed world is incompatible with both meeting our carbon reduction targets and global equity. So we have to think, everything we do has to be in the context of carbon reduction. And that doesn't, and actually, if you look at the way that carbon is distributed across the population, it goes not completely, but almost exactly in line with income. And one of the things I think we should have a real look at as a positive way out of some of the problems that we've got is carbon allocation and trading. Because if you give people a carbon allocation and enable, probably through collective forms, I don't know that it would work as an individual transaction, people to trade their allocation, you'd get a distribution from the rich to the poor of income, which would be quite substantial if you look at the enormous amounts that rich people emit in terms of greenhouse gas emissions compared with what most poor people do. So I do think that it has been looked at seriously by government in the mid-2000s. It was abandoned, sort of put in a too difficult box, but it keeps coming back as an idea that really deserves more careful attention. It's not the answer, it's not like a silver bullet, but it's a really important way of locking in tackling poverty with tackling climate change.
Thank you. Would any of our panellists care to pick up this point? I mean, we've been discussing in the past a switch from taxes on good things like people's labour to taxing pollution and waste and so forth. So there's a green taxes agenda. There may be a local agenda. What can a small country, in addition to renewable energy, what can it do to get us onto a more sustainable path?
It can tax unproductive capital. And unproductive capital is in land. It also can tax speculation, where you have speculation for the sake of speculation. So what's interesting is our equities market, which is meant to provide funding for business, is actually just a market for generating volatility, so you can speculate between different price indices. So the original function of the stock market is a good one, providing business with capital. But we now know that nothing in our financial architecture provides business with capital because we reward non-investment capital. And if we can find a way which is there, I support the transaction tax, by the way. I think the Tobin tax is a very good idea, because what that does is that sucks money away from productive investment. And that unproductive capital is in land, it's in capital. So we need to tax not income, but wealth.
And income.
Yeah, both.
Much more progressive taxation than we have now.
The poor rely far more on income than the rich do. So the point is, if you tax income less, you help the poor far, far more. If you tax wealth more, we clearly know who pays the higher cost.
Not only if you only if you tax the poor much less.
Well, that's
not if you tax the rich much more.
The poor as a percentage have less wealth and rely almost exclusively on income. So it follows, if you move the taxation system away from income to wealth, you actually create a far more productive dynamic economy that taxes what needs to be taxed, which is unproductive use of capital.
Thank you. I'm going to take 3 or 4 really quick points, just at the back first of all, please. I'll come down to the front.
Hi there, my name's Lorna Kettles and I'm from the Scottish Women's Convention, and I'd just like to ask the panel a general question, sort of what Owen described earlier with regards to cuts to housing benefit, cuts to council tax benefit, child tax credits, and generally the welfare reform is going to have a detrimental impact on women. And I just wondered the panel thoughts on how you can take forward any alternative agenda without having a strong gendered focus at the heart of it.
Thank you. And also back on the other side, was somebody, woman with the black t-shirt, thank you.
how can people possibly pay another tax when they're unemployed or they're living in poverty?
What was that?
You're talking about green tax.
Could you repeat the question, sorry?
How can people possibly pay another tax when they're unemployed and living in poverty?
Okay, thank you. So, big question about where any extra taxes fall within society. And in the middle, I spy Edward Harkins with a question.
Yes, as you say, Edward Harkins, and I admit I am another man. My question is really quite a practical one, and it's probably mostly for Philip, but maybe also for Judith. We're recognising the very gross inequalities in the ownership of assets in what Philip called a corrupt system, and gross accumulation of wealth. Philip, you're arguing about taxation there, about on income, as whether it's effective or not. I think there's aspects like negative income tax. We could also talk about actually giving money back to the poor. But given that we're talking about an existing grossly unequal society, in practical terms, I take the local trading and horizontal collaboration, I take that on board, but in practical terms, how against these oligarchs and powerful elites are we going to move? Does it need things like truly powerfully redistributive taxes or even statutory confiscation of assets?
Thank you, and hope you're taking a note of these folks. Just down the front here, thank you.
Tell me if you can hear me. Scott Sinclair, I'm also from the Clydesdale district and involved in so many things, and I see all aspects of life. The poverty one, obviously that's what we're here about. But I'm interested in, we've got a panel of 5 people sitting there, and also the people contributing from the floor here, and I've never heard the word education mentioned. Now, you have to bear in mind that over a period, well, there's 2 generations, we're on to a 3rd generation, that some families, particularly out in the rural areas, they've never had somebody work in their homes. Now, if you're a youngster, been brought up in a family where everybody can't wait to sign on the brew, where does that youngster think it should be going in life? You have to educate kids. You have to give them a sense of worth, a respect in themselves, because if they don't respect themselves, they don't have in other people. You have to educate young people, and you have to start now, in that they have to have a place in life, they have to have a target, aspirations. You can as many labels as you want to. If you don't educate people in where they should be going, you're never going to turn anything around.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come to you in a moment, if I may. I just wanted to, where's Peter? Peter Kelly. I want to turn to some of our Twitter followers and include them as well in this. Peter, what's catching your eye that can be shared with this audience, at least, on Twitter?
It's too hard to keep up, Jim. There's too many tweets coming in. We did have some earlier on. There's a lot responding to some of the questions that are the discussion that's taking place, but there was one question that caught my eye, which was about employers. Judith mentioned right at the start, what's the how do we bring employers into this? And one of the questions was about how do we actually get some employers, maybe not that many, but some that are still not paying the minimum wage, let alone the living wage. So how do we actually ensure that people have got their rights in the workplace? That was one thing that struck me, and if there's more, I'll come back to you.
Thank you. And if you'll be patient just for one more second, panellists, another question at this table here. Thank you.
I just want to say that I think the situation that we're facing at the moment is we're in the middle of the biggest crisis of neoliberal capitalism since the 1930s. Power concedes nothing without a demand, as someone once said. You know, all this talk about green taxes, it's all very well. We all want to save the environment and so on. But the crisis which we face, which we're in the middle of right now, is much, much greater than this. So this is just tinkering at the edges. I mean, where you've got a situation where there's £120 billion in unpaid tax by rich corporations and offshore people who keep their money offshore. You know, what we're going to have to do, I'm afraid, is we're going to have to take drastic political action. Because the people in our communities, as the lady from Oxfam said there, are really going to be suffering, and not just suffering, but dying. As a result of these changes. So I just wish to you know, really press that point at home, that what we need is you know, action, and thanks for...
Could you just Tell us who you are, please.
Yeah, I'm John McArdle from the Black Triangle Anti-Defamation Campaign in defence of disability rights.
Thank you, John. Okay, great. Now we can't possibly do justice to all the questions with every panellist responding, but I just invite you to, each of you, if you wanted to pick out maybe one of those to respond to, and let's not forget Andy's question right at the start about sustainability and consumption. Who would like to kick off on any of those points? Anna.
Jim, there were two questions at the back that I couldn't hear,
okay.
Both from women.
One of them was about women being disproportionately affected by the crisis.
One was about gender equality. One was about if we're going to have new tax, the green taxes, let's make sure they don't fall upon poor people and people who are unemployed. Yeah. And we also had points about education.
Yeah, no, I got the others. It was just the two at the back there. Thank you.
Well, I'll start then. I think the point is let's go back to first principles. Why are people rich? There's legitimate sources of wealth and illegitimate sources of wealth. And you need to make that distinction. Somebody can invent something that the whole world takes up. That's part of why globalization makes some people rich. But some of the people who are rich because they run monopolies and oligopolies. And what they do is they capture wealth, they capture assets, and they deny market entry to others. So one of the reasons that we're poor, and actually the British economy is like an hourglass, it's squeezed in the middle. 76% of all British businesses are sole traders, and they can't get ahead because they pay lots of overheads that companies like GE or Barclays don't pay because they're all offshore. So what we have to do is have a radical new competition policy. The competition policy that we've been presently following with the model of consumer welfare is pro-monopoly and pro-oligopoly. And until we can break up the big monopolies and nationalise some of them if they need to be, if they're natural assets. But the real key to breaking up that control of wealth is market competition and new market entry. And what we have to do is, from the bottom, collaborate, form new businesses, form social enterprises from all the different sorts of capital that are already being spent in those communities, and compete, but compete on the local level. And that way, you can outcompete and start to transform wealth into those societies. And to end with the education point that the gentleman made earlier, this is absolutely crucial. One of the terrifying things in British education is our reading now in the world. We're 23rd in the world for reading. What this means is if most people just earn wages, then they're really, really in trouble. Because actually, if you look at share of GDP, returns to labour as a proportion of GDP have been falling since 1968. And for unskilled people, it's been falling since the 1970s. So wages are getting less and less of a bigger and bigger cake. And one of the reasons that wages are falling is educational levels are falling. We're being outcompeted by better universities, better schools, and better education elsewhere in the world. And until we can upskill our communities, they're going to be more and more in trouble. We've got to radically rethink both education, ownership, and market access.
Thank you. Anna, you want to come in?
I don't think we should imagine for a minute that the solution to the problems that we have are more competition and more market freedom.
For the poor, not for the rich.
It doesn't matter, because what that does is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of the economy, which isn't just about people exchanging goods in the marketplace. It's also about what people do in their homes and in their daily lives. There's an uncommodified economy, if you like, where people exchange caring and teaching and learning. You don't need to interrupt me, Philip. We cannot, and we never will, be able to tackle poverty just by having, there is this sort of, it's an old trope among people on the right who think that as long as you free up the market, make it as free as possible, and make sure as many people can own things as possible, then it will eventually settle down into some kind of justice. There is this, there'll be trickle down and everyone will be, this is just an illusion, and it's based on a really fundamental misunderstanding of the way that our economy works, and I mean economy in a broad sense, which includes the reproductive economy and the productive economy. And although I think you probably made the point, the person at the back there, certainly the crisis that we have now hits women much harder than men. not just because of the cuts in the public sector, and women are the main, hold more public sector jobs than men do, but also because we women do most of the unpaid work in the community. We are picking up the pieces. We are the people on whose shoulders the burden falls when the government cuts back public services. So we have to bear that in mind. So we must think about not just a purely market-based solutions to the problem, which have failed manifestly forever, but also we must look for different kinds of solution in the human economy, the economy of caring, the reproductive economy as well.
Thank you. And Judith, briefly, please.
From my perspective, it's about what values do we want to live by? What values do we care about? What values are we going to promote, and what values are we going to diminish? So if we're going to promote the values of compassion, caring, justice, social justice, equality, solidarity, actually, then we need to do something different, because those are not the values that are running the show at the moment. The values that are running the show at the moment are about individual gain over somebody else's loss. And so if you look at measures and say, well, who's going to win and who's going to lose out of that, then you have a simple assessment of what impact and what value it's going to generate. So the women at the back, we as Oxfam, we talk a lot about what happens to women, because women are everywhere you go in the world, women are the poorest. They are the most poor, and more of them are poor. So it's always women who are at the bottom of the pile, and subsequently their children, except when decisions are made by men who then promote the boys. And so when you see where power and access to resources go, and you track how it pans out, you can see what values are being supported and what values are being encouraged. And from my perspective, that's a better measure of any action we take, whether it be promoting the market, whether it be promoting collaboration, whether it be promoting mutualisation. It's like, what's the impact of that action? Who's going to win and who's going to lose? And if we understand that, I think, then we have a better way of assessing what's good and what's going to bring what we want to life and diminish what we don't want.
Thank you. I'm going to propose we maybe lunched for this, run 10 minutes over into our lunch time, because this is really fascinating stuff, and we do have another question, and I'm going to come to Ghazala to answer that one first. Okay, so Charlie Martin at table 16, where are you, Charlie? Charlie has a question that was submitted previously. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, panel. Just wanted to ask, when we have an award-winning third sector social enterprise in Scotland, who have a proven track record of getting people into work in Scotland and who reinvest their profits into the communities in which it operates, has been overlooked by the UK government in favour of a private enterprise whose profits from the work programme will ultimately end up in Australia. Does the panel agree that the big society has actually been overlooked in favour of big business?
Very nice.
So, has the big society, which, as you probably know, doesn't play too well north of the border, but has the big society actually been overlooked in favour of big business? Ghazala.
Well, it certainly seems so. David Cameron's idea of the big society, I mean, it certainly sounds charming. Would be lovely to see some of it being put into practice. However, practically, and again going back to being pragmatic, I think David's concept is rather far from being realistic. And this is especially so when David and the government do otherwise. Then how can people follow this concept if our leaders are not practicing what they're preaching?
Thank you. Owen, Phillip?
I mean, just on that point, I mean, basically what we're talking about is big businesses scrounging off the state. It's socialism for the rich. A4E, ripping off the taxpayer. But I just wanted to come back to the earlier points, and that was in terms of, as John put it, power doesn't concede anything without a demand. And earlier points, how do we get employers to pay a proper wage in the workforce? And the point I have to, and it hasn't been made in the debate yet, is this is the 6th richest country on earth. And during the boom time, even during the boom time, people were getting poorer. So from 2004 onwards, the bottom half's income stagnated and the bottom third's actually went into decline. In the current crisis, the top 1,000 people in Britain, the Sunday Times do a rich list each year, their wealth went up by 49% last year. The year before that, it went up by, that's the top boardroom pay went up by 49%. The year before that, it went up by 55%. The top 1,000 richest people went up by a fifth. The year before that, it went up by 30%. It's the biggest jump ever recorded, whilst for the average Briton, they're going through the biggest squeeze in living standards since the 1920s. And as the Resolution Foundation pointed out, in 2016, the average Briton will be poorer than they were at the turn of the century. The point to make is that this country is not out of money, as George Osborne would have it. It is an extremely wealthy country, but that wealth is locked in the bank accounts of the people at the top. And the only way of challenging that is to organise from below. We have some of the weakest trade unions in the world, in Western world, not least because we have some of the most, as Tony Blair said it, the most restrictive anti-union laws in the Western world. Unless we have strong trade unions which can fight for people in the workplace to make sure workers get a proper share of the wealth that they are creating, then we won't be able to tackle working poverty. We'll have to rely on tax credits to top up poor wages. So it's all about organising from the bottom to challenge the fact that they're basically at the moment in this recession, there was a wealth and power grab going on at the top.
Philip?
I agree with the analysis in the sense of a small elite has captured wealth and power. But what I don't agree with, what we do about it. I mean, what's interesting is some of the tweets' response about, I'm arguing the poor should buy their way out of poverty. That's not what I'm arguing. The only radical agenda is ownership and trade, because the trade union movement has captured the labour movement in a way that is not helpful for either. One of the greatest sources of hostility to workers' cooperatives are the trade union movement, precisely because workers' cooperatives change you from just a wage-centred entity to people who have a stake. So what I'm trying to suggest is that we need to radically reshift what we think will make the difference. And what I want to suggest, and what I think is going with the grain of history, is actually trying to drive innovation and ownership to the bottom of our society, because that's the only source of wealth and trade. And the point about, I think it was a lovely point, very well made, about the big society being dominated by big business, I agree. And what's happened, and it's very unfortunate, is that the capital requirements before you enter the work programme were so high, no charity or third sector had 20 million in the bank to enable them to compete. What that is, again, is a monopoly. It's locking out the small and the intermediate and the local who can make a difference. What I would like to do is turn the work programme inside out. I would like only localised providers to be able to make the difference, because they can make more of a difference than the big providers. And that will endow absolutely everything we need, which is what Judith has been speaking about. And poverty is more than just money. And I want to flag this before I end. Poverty is about loneliness, isolation, depression. And we have to broaden the account from a simple economic model to ways in which we can create human happiness. Social capital is the horrible techie word, but people won't come together unless they like one another, unless we can create bonds. And we need to recreate bonds, because what's happened is we have shattered our communities, we have stripped away working class institutions, we've denied them paths to opportunity, to ownership, to access. And both left and right have conspired in that. And until we can rebuild our institutions and our communities, there really is no way to tackle any of the other wider issues.
Go. Sorry.
Just on the big society, I think it's very telling what's going on, because we've been told that we must take more responsibility for ourselves, and we must more action must take place in communities and in at grassroots among individuals and families. And I've been going around the country talking to community-based groups, and I'm going around England, sorry. But anyway, I think it's probably the same here. But that the story I keep getting told is that they're struggling, They're losing their grants. They can't compete for contracts. And instead of doing what they want to do, which is to look forward and try and make things better in the future and envisage a better society in future, they're completely preoccupied with day-to-day survival. Now, the reason this is happening is that for a very long time, and particularly under New Labour most recently, that they have had support from local government. They've been getting the places and the small grants and the medium-sized grants and the small contracts so that they could flourish and they could invite people in and they could do new things and they could take risks and they could innovate. So what this tells us is that there's a very important relationship between government on the one hand and civil society on the other. And we need to make that work better than it does. But this government, in the name of deficit reduction and promoting a neoliberal economy, if you like, are simply starving the very organisations that ought to be there with the strength and the will and the capacity to get things changing in their communities.
I suppose I want to say a word for the terms of the debate in Scotland being a bit different from the terms of the debate in England. The big society in Scotland never had any traction as anything really, other than to be frank, a Tory construct which was meant to co-opt activity which was already going on. With the departure of Steve Hilton, even that seems to be a bit of a busted flush now within the coalition. I did hear a brilliant quote from a guy from the Church of England who said, as far as he was concerned, the big society had been around since the time of the apostles. So, which struck me as being an astute observation. I suppose what I wanted to say was about that relationship between local government and civil society, because I do think there is, I think clearly there is a massive role for both, but local government has disassociated itself, it feels like, from civil society. It's disempowered civil society and doesn't want to incorporate it into its analysis. I'm talking about in Scotland, and I've seen it, masses of evidence of that. And I think that needs to be turned around. And what is the Christie Commission had a really good look at this, and clarified, I think, the role of government in relation to poverty reduction and generating social justice and mediating that gap. And I think the terms of the debate in Scotland are very different from those down south, and I think we have a lot more potential actually to transform those relationships. But money and the allocation of those resources is a huge issue within that, and we have to fight for those resources to be held within communities, not just to sustain local government structures which are not serving those communities.
Absolutely right.
Okay. Let's take a very brief...
I know that won't be popular everywhere.
Completely right.
Can we take a very brief supplementary point from Danny, who's sitting here, just in the middle? Which you won't have time to respond to, but please make the point anyway, Danny.
Speaking here. It's been very interesting listening to the panel, and I think we've got to move beyond the analysis, because one of the great dangers is we know the problems and we get bogged down in paralysis by analysis, by revisiting the arguments over and over. We have to take action. We've got 2.5 years until maybe a referendum. And I think during that 2 to 2.5 years, I'm just looking at that Twitter board, it struck me as very similar to the campaign that Spartacus ran down south very, very prominently in terms of the NHS and welfare reforms. The Spartacus movement was absolutely phenomenal in a very short space of time. And rather than invoke the spirit of William Wallace, much as I love the man, I think we should in Scotland be invoking the spirit of Spartacus and actually getting ourselves a site similar to that, so the entire Scottish population can feed in their views in terms of poverty and what the possible solution should be, and harness that collective strength in that fight back.
Thank you very much. We're going to conclude with one final question, and I would ask for possible one-sentence answers without punctuation, if possible. And it touches kind of on some points Danny and others have made already, and it's if Scotland were to become independent, what kind of welfare system could be afforded? What would we do with those welfare powers. And it's not compulsory to answer, but we'd be keen to know if you have any thoughts on the scenario of more powers, I suppose independent or with enhanced devolution. Anyone want to pick up on that point?
Well, just living wage instead of tax credits, social housing instead of housing benefits, and what have I done? Jobs, housing. What was the other one I said? Oh, and jobs, of course, sorry. The jobs crisis and an actual active interventionist strategy like we have in Germany to combat that. So it's jobs, housing and low wages. If we do that, we can actually reform welfare, if you like, without kicking people at the bottom.
Thank you.
I think that if what we don't want is a smaller version of a statism that already doesn't work. And what I think, in line with what Judith spoke about, I think the great need, if we really want to change outcomes, is push budgets out to communities, push budgets to the people who are delivering services. And if we can do that, that's one of the preconditions of changing everything. It's not the only one. So what I would hope for is if we have Devo Max, I mean, I'm pro-union, I'm pro-unionist, I'd hate, Scotland is too important, I think, to our shared culture. But if we had Devo Max, we need Devo Max not just for a local town hall, but for local communities. Thank you.
What kind of welfare system could we afford? Well, I think that's kind of a difficult question to answer just yet, because we don't know what Scotland's finance system will look like or what the financial implications are going to be. So I think it's a bit too early to be able to honestly answer that question.
Thank you. Hannah.
That's absolutely correct. But anyway, since we have an opportunity to guess at this, I'd say a more progressive taxation system, much more progressive. And I think we should think carefully about building the redistribution of wealth on a carbon allocation and taxing system. I think there's a really radical potential there. And I think we should also think about the redistribution of paid and unpaid time, a shorter working week, more people who are out of work, in work, more time to do things that aren't paid for people who have got jobs, and that would need to go with a much better minimum wage, and as Owen was saying. So I think there are some possibilities there.
And last word, Judith.
I think I have just a final addition to some of that, which is really that we need to stop stigmatising people who are poor, and that's we need to transform the way society regards, communicates about and talks about that, and we need to respect actually the massive challenges that people overcome living on low incomes, and so that's an entirely different dynamic, and one which I think also would contribute to a massive change in how things are delivered.
And I would just observe, though I'm not supposed to, that maybe one of the hopeful things about this debate is that some of the ideas we've already had could be delivered within existing powers if we had enough will, commitment, and chose to make those trade-offs in a different way. Ladies and gentlemen, we've run way over the time we'd planned to, but I hope you'll agree with me that it's been well worth it. Please thank our panellists.